Hi there! Following up on my review of Klukai's skill kit, here's my fashionably late how to build guide, where I will delve into her keys, fortifications, gear options and some tips to round things off. As usual, if you are unfamiliar with her skills or are still unsure whether she's worth pulling or how much you should invest in her, I suggest watching my previous review first, where I cover all of this in much detail. Whichever level of investment you determined was right for your account, I hope your pulls were not as terrible as mine, and all 50/50s went your way. Without further ado, let us get started. Starting with her keys. Her first key, Deadly Entwine, takes effect when there is only one enemy on the field. At the start of the turn, this key applies one stack of corrosive infusion to said enemy and regenerates 2 confectance points for Klukai. The utility of this key is limited to boss battles, but in most cases its effect is overshadowed by the DPS options. You only would consider using this when your team setup is shy of 1 or 2 support actions, meaning you reach at least 5 but not 7 confectance points to recharge Klukai's ultimate. Speaking of DPS options, her second key, One Fell Swoop, increases her ultimate's damage by 30% when it hits only one target. Again, this key is intended for boss battles and is as straightforward as can be. This key becomes one of Klukai's staples once you reach her V3 upgrade, but should not be equipped for normal map clearing content where you would generally want to avoid hitting only a single non-boss enemy with her ultimate. Next, her third key, No Mercy, increases the damage of her stacking dot, Corrosive Infusion, by 15% against stability broken enemies. The value of this effect is greatest against bosses with reliable phases of stability break and sufficient HP to stack up the dot to its limit. Normally, Corrosive Infusion only triggers its damage at the end of the enemy's action, meaning the 15% damage bonus applies only once per turn and only when the target is still in stability break. Before V6, this key is outclassed by her other options. When Klukai is at V6, she is able to trigger Corrosive Infusion 3 times each round, so you see the greatest benefit from this key's damage increase then. When fully stacked, the dot reaches a multiplier of 180%, so the damage boost is significant in absolute terms and outperforms her other options, which increase her ultimate's damage against bosses. For instance, when comparing the effect of her key One Fell Swoop, which grants a 30% damage bonus to the ultimate against single targets, you can expect under fully buffed conditions an effective damage increase of about only 8%. When using the ultimate twice per turn, you gain 16% extra damage on a 200% skill multiplier. When using No Mercy instead, you gain a 15% damage bonus on her dot, which amounts to an effective increase of about 6% damage. The diminishing returns are not as bad as with her ultimate because the bonuses applying to the dot are less saturated. Since Corrosive Infusion triggers 3 times, you gain 18% extra damage on a 540% skill multiplier, assuming the dot is fully stacked. Keep in mind that this advantage is completely reversed in turns without stability break, and is also lower when the boss puts up a defensive mechanism before the third trigger of the dot. Here, the current Gunsmoke boss puts up a 75% defense boost before he concludes his turn, drastically reducing the damage he receives from the subsequent dot. Note though that this third instance of damage happens before the stability restoration at the end of the enemy's turn, so it does still benefit from the key. Therefore, over the course of the whole battle, the difference may become negligible and boosting her dots or her ultimate's damage is fine so long as your Klukai is V6. Having said that, below V6, this key is mostly relegated for use in normal stages. Given that most enemies do not have high stability shields and Klukai applies a dot with all her attacks, you may get some use out of this key's effect. Nevertheless, you will rarely see high stack counts of Corrosive Infusion against low HP targets. Therefore, the total skill multiplier of the dot will be low, meaning the absolute damage increase from this key will likely be unimpressive. Moving on, her fourth key, Strong Support, is the one key you will always bring no matter the situation. It restores a confectance point for Klukai whenever allies execute support actions, which is crucial in resetting her ultimate cooldown, as it gets lowered for every 3 points restored. Without this key, her only means of restoring confectance points is her own active corrosion damage, or any type of corrosion damage from her allies. Running her alongside Mekti and Petya makes things easier, but having this option makes team building less restrictive. With her V2 upgrade, she needs to restore only 9 confectance points to fully reset the 6 turn cooldown of her ultimate, so this key enables her ultimate spam against bosses. Here, you see a V0 Klukai with a 4 turn cooldown after having used her 2 ultimates to attack a total of 7 enemies, meaning she recharged 7 confectance points by herself, lowering her cooldown by 2. When Shakri uses her as 1, triggering her own assist due to overburn application and Chongju's assist, Klukai regains another 2 points, lowering the cooldown by an additional turn. Before her V2, you require 18 points in total for a full reset, so you will likely have to use her other abilities in between. Next, her 5th key, Limit Break, is another staple for boss fights, as it lowers the width of her ultimate to 3 tiles, and increases its damage dealt for each tile by 10%. Before her V6, the width of her ultimate is 5 tiles, so this key grants her a 20% damage bonus. At V6, the width changes to 7 tiles, resulting in a 40% damage boost. The utility of this key is not restricted to boss stages. On normal maps, it largely depends on the positioning of the enemy groups. Here we can see the benefit of the ultimate's width. With sufficient movement, we would have been able to hit all 5 targets in the area. For the second use, we are again flexible with our positioning, since the 5-tile AoE covers the 3 nearby targets. With reduced width, we have to take a different approach, aiming our ultimate from the front rather than the sides. As you can see, we still managed to hit a similar number of targets with the smaller AoE. Since Klukai boasts great mobility and range, having this key equipped should be beneficial most of the time. If you find a map where you would really prefer having a wider width, you can swap the key out. In particular at V6, when her range covers a width of 7 tiles, you may prefer the convenience of annihilating the entire screen over the by then somewhat unnecessary damage increase. Her 6th key, Moment of Doom, makes her second dot, Toxic Infiltration, apply 1 stack of her first dot, Corrosive Infusion, if the enemy survived the damage that it received from the dot. At V0, Toxic Infiltration triggers its damage only upon the target's death, so this effect is more reliably activated with Klukai's V1 upgrade, when her S2 triggers the damage upon application of the dot. Before that, you have to kill an infected target while ensuring that another target is within 3 tiles. Here, you see the target on the left outside of the skill's AoE but within range of the middle target. When using Klukai's S2, we apply Toxic Infiltration before the damage is dealt. Then, the skill's damage defeats the middle target due to critical hit. This triggers the on-death effect of the dot, which spreads it to the nearby targets and deals damage. As the enemy survives the attack, it gets affected by a stack of Corrosive Infusion due to the key. This process is very much simplified once Toxic Infiltration deals its damage immediately, thereby also stacking Corrosive Infusion right away. If you have every one, this key is a decent option for normal stages. In summary, Klukai's fixed key setup slightly differs between boss and normal battles, and also depends on her dupes. As previously mentioned, the one key will likely always bring a strong support, which helps regenerate Confectance points, thereby lowering Klukai's ultimate cooldown. Limit Break is another universal useful key, which reduces the ultimate's width in return for a 20 or 40% damage bonus, depending on whether Klukai is V6 or not. Against bosses, you will always want this key. For map clearing, it depends on the layout. One Fell Swoop is a decent option limited to boss battles, granting a 30% damage bonus on her ultimate against single targets. Since using her ultimate on single non-boss targets should be strictly avoided, you will never want this key for normal maps. If your Klukai is V6 and you do not want to go through the hassle of switching her setup, you can instead use No Mercy, which works on all stages with a similar damage increase against bosses. However, its effectiveness depends on the speed at which you stack Corrosive Infusion. Aside from that, for normal maps, Moment of Doom is your only other reasonable option, applying additional stacks of Corrosive Infusion when Toxic Infiltration deals damage without killing a target. The key's impact will be more noticeable with Klukai's V1, as this will trigger the damage from Toxic Infiltration when using her S2. At V6, Klukai's ultimate also triggers the dot's damage, making the key even more noteworthy. Moving on, her common key Murderous Return increases the damage of her first active attack by 10% if her Confectance index is full at the start of her turn. This is well suited to her ultimate spam playstyle, which does not consume any Confectance points. However, the effect only applies to the first use of the ultimate or skill in that turn, and nothing else. In particular at V6, when her dots become a significant source of Klukai's damage, this key falls off hard. Before that it is usable, but when you are at V0 you will likely spend Confectance points by using her skills, so ideally you would want to ensure that your index is fully recharged to receive the buff on the next turn. In the case of her S2, this means you will have to hit up to 6 targets, depending on your current points when using the skill. As shown here, when at full Confectance points, the skill consumes 3 points and immediately restores 4, bringing Klukai back to full and reactivating the key's effect for the next turn. Of course, when you have her key strong support equipped, the other team members can help with the Confectance point management via their support actions. Her S1 restores 2 extra Confectance points when scoring a kill, so you could get away with hitting fewer targets. Here, the skill consumes 3 points, but restores 4 on a single target by scoring a kill. Note that the 2 instances of damage from the skill each restore 1 point per target hit, even if the first hit already defeated the enemy. Next, outside of boss battles, Petya's key is a good option. As long as you manage to hit at least 2 targets, you will benefit from a 7% damage bonus. This key is a great choice for Klukai below V3. Afterward, you would probably prefer options that also work for bossing. One of the best generic DPS keys is provided by Dushevnaya. while probably unavailable to most free-to-play players, it grants a permanent 10% elemental damage bonus against targets who are not faster than the equipper. This condition is easily satisfied against bosses, and since Klukai has a high base movement of 6 tiles, it will also apply against most normal enemies. If you do not have Dushevnaya, the poor man's version of the key comes from Webley. Her key's effect is almost identical, but provides 7% damage. Investing your cores in Webley just for this key is a tough call, but it is one of the best generic effects. Other than that, another universally useful DPS key is unlocked by maxing Sharkry. Her key grants a 7% damage bonus when you have at least 2 buffs. Meeting this requirement is no issue for Klukai since her permanent stacking buff, Competitive Spirit, counts as 1, and regardless of whether you use Planeta or Skilla, you will gain a second permanent buff from the respective weapon effects. Here you see that by hitting 2 targets with the ultimate, we gain 2 stacks of her buff, and by killing a target or ending the extra action, we gain Path Patrol stacks from Planeta. Continuing with the Fortifications. Her V1 upgrades her second skill in multiple ways, while also changing the behavior of her Toxic Infiltration. First, her S2 receives an additional 50% damage bonus when the enemy is already affected by Toxic Infiltration. At base, the skill benefits already from a 50% bonus, so now it adds up to 30%. Note that this bonus applies only to the damage of her S2 and nothing else, and it does not increase the skill multiplier but instead adds up with other damage bonuses. The situations where you benefit from this increase are not too common, as the ways to apply Toxic Infiltration are limited. One option is to use her S2 twice against the target, or when the target is close enough to have been affected by the spreading dot. At V3 and above, another option would be her ultimate, which you would then follow up with her S2. In other words, we are mainly talking about situations where you face rather tanky groups of enemies. Then, her V1 upgrades the synergy of her S2 and her Toxic Infiltration by changing its damage dealing condition to take effect immediately, rather than when the affected enemy dies. Without this change, Toxic Infiltration is more of an afterthought to the skill. Moreover, the dot now spreads to targets in its AoE, so even if you do not hit every enemy with Klukai's S2 or her ultimate at V3 and above, you may still end up wiping out all nearby targets. This makes the dot much more effective, in particular when you are trying to clear out groups of enemies that do not immediately fall over at the sight of Klukai's bike. Here you can see a side-by-side comparison of this change. On the right, you can see how the additional damage triggers from Toxic Infiltration significantly affect the skill's output. Note that the dot's damage behavior is only changed for her S2. Here, I am using a V3 Klukai to apply Toxic Infiltration using the ultimate, but no instances of damage occur from the dot. This changes with her V6 upgrade, which is independent from the modifications brought by her V1. Next, her V2 makes several important upgrades to her passive. She now starts the battle with 3 stacks of her damage buff Competitive Spirit and increases the stack limit from 8 to 12, meaning the total damage bonus gets increased from 40 to 60%. Before this upgrade, she could only gain stacks by dealing active corrosion damage herself. Now, she also gains stacks from allies dealing corrosion damage. This is a meaningful increase to the speed at which she stacks up the buff when she runs with Petya and Mekdi, since each of Petya's assists will grant Klukai 1 stack. Here, when running the corrosion team setup in Gunsmoke, each of Klukai's V6 ultimates generates, alongside Petya's 3 assists, a total of 4 stacks of Competitive Spirit. After just 1 turn, the buff is fully stacked. Then, the Confectance points based reduction of her ultimate cooldown is doubled. Previously, she would reduce the ultimate cooldown by 1 turn for every 3 Confectance points gained. Now, the cooldown is reduced by 2 turns. Therefore, you only require 9 Confectance points to fully reset the ultimate, rather than 18 Confectance points. This is one of the most important changes to enable her ultimate spam playstyle. When using her against bosses at V6, Petya alone will be enough to regenerate the required 7 Confectance points for Klukai every turn. Additionally, the speed at which she stacks her dot, Corrosive Infusion, is increased by adding an extra stack to enemies that are already affected by the debuff, while also including her allies as a source of dot application when they deal corrosion damage. From the previous example, you can see that the first attack from Klukai added 1 stack of Corrosive Infusion, and Petya's 3 assists, which are changed to corrosion damage by Mekdi, added another 6 stacks. With the next use of her ultimate, the dot is fully stacked on the boss. Finally, there's also an additional DPS increase added as a bonus effect to the dot, which reduces the target's defense by 1% for each stack. The translation here does not make this clear, but this is not a general defense reduction but rather specific to corrosion damage. This means that all sources of Klukai's damage, as well as any other corrosion damage from her allies, ignore 15% of their enemy's defense at max stacks. Alongside the 20% defense ignore trait from her signature weapon and a 30% defense reduction from her ultimate, Klukai will ignore 65% of her target's defense. This is only relevant for boss battles, but the impact of defense penetration on DPS is significant. That said, a lot of her V2 prepares her to better perform in boss battles, for which she will also require her V3 upgrade. Speaking of, her V3 is a major breakpoint that enables her for single target boss fights. Prior to this upgrade, you needed to kill 2 enemies in order to get a second use of her ultimate. Now, you only need to hit 2 enemies or a boss enemy to go again. Moreover, Klukai's ultimate benefits from a damage bonus depending on the number of targets hit, up to 50%, which is permanently granted against bosses. This is not an increase of the ultimate skill multiplier, so the effective impact, as always, is diminished. Importantly, the ultimate now applies a 30% defense reduction debuff and toxic infiltration before damage is dealt. The defense shred in particular adds significant utility to her kit, making her a good flex pick for a lot of teams, so long as the team is able to recharge enough confectance points for Klukai. Keep in mind, as noted before, that before her V6 upgrade, toxic infiltration does not offer much benefit if the targets are not defeated by the attack. Unlike her V1 upgrade, which changed the dot and S2 interaction by triggering its damage upon application, it does not do so when using ultimate. That said, with her V3 upgrade, Klukai is slowly becoming a decent single target DPS, though her damage for such fights may still not be quite at the level you would want a character to be at after pulling her a total of 4 times. Her V4 upgrades the damage of her S1, boosting the skill damage multiplier of the first instance of damage by 20% and increasing the second instance's multiplier by 5% for each stack of corrosive infusion on the target. Increases to the skill damage multiplier are always superior to damage bonuses, but since her S1 is not used in boss battles and probably also rarely if ever used on normal maps once you have reached Klukai's V2, this upgrade does nothing to increase her output. Once you have invested this much into your Klukai, the main focus of her performance will be directed toward boss battles, so sadly her V4 is filler material. Similarly, her V5 upgrades her S2 by increasing its range by 2 tiles and skill multiplier by 20%, a change that will likely be irrelevant. However, independent of that, it contains an upgrade for toxic infiltration, increasing its damage multiplier from 60% to 80% of her attack, while also increasing the spread radius from 3 to 4 tiles. The 20% additional skill multiplier becomes relevant with Klukai's V6 upgrade, which triggers the dot upon application with her ultimate, so by itself this change is mostly a stepping stone toward her next upgrade. The description does not state this clearly, but this change is not limited to her S2. Here you see me first use Klukai's V6 ultimate to apply and trigger toxic infiltration. Then, on the next turn, I am using her S2 for comparison. Both instances of damage are about equal. The damage of the S2, shown on the right, is only slightly higher due to a few more stacks of her buffs and dot. Then, and certainly noteworthy, when Klukai attacks targets with toxic infiltration, they will receive 30% more damage from Klukai's active attacks, meaning everything but her dots. In boss battles, this essentially equates to a permanent 30% damage bonus for her ultimate, which there is her only source of active damage. Since Klukai's ultimate benefits from multiple bonuses already, the effective increase will be diminished to somewhere around a 10% damage boost. Finally, her V6 upgrade turns her into the current best all-around DPS in the game. The most significant change comes simply from the new effect that triggers both her dots after she uses her ultimate. When fully stacked, Corrosive Infusion has a 180% skill damage multiplier, and Toxic Infiltration adds another 80%, totaling to 260% additional skill damage after each use of her ultimate. If that was not enough, the dots are also considered AoE damage, which triggers assist from Petya, making the two an extremely potent duo that further gets enhanced when Mekti is released to boost Petya's support actions. During my review of Klukai, I have done a detailed explanation of the difference between her V3 and V6 performance via a simulated side-by-side comparison, so I will not belabor this point again. According to damage calculations, you can expect an effective difference in damage between these upgrades of about 290%. Moving on to her gear. Her signature weapon, Skilla, comes with the high base attack value of 390 and a 15% attack bonus. The weapon effect unconditionally boosts AoE corrosion damage by 15%, up to 25% at max calibration. This damage increase applies to everything in her kit, including her dots, which are considered as AoE damage. Moreover, she gains a stacking damage buff which goes up whenever corrosion damage is dealt, again including her dots, starting at 2% up to 10%, or twice that at max calibration. The weapon trait allows her to ignore 10% of the target's defense if a weakness is exploited, or 20% if a corrosion weakness is exploited. This trait is the reason why her signature weapon becomes her best in slot choice against high defense targets, meaning most bosses. So long as the boss is weak to corrosion, or you are bringing Mekti to implant the weakness, this weapon will be slightly ahead in damage as compared to its strongest competitor, Planeta. This advantage becomes less relevant in normal map stages with lower defense enemies, of which many may also not be weak to corrosion. The impact of Klukai's dupes is higher than her signature weapon, and before Heavy 3 you would only rarely be fighting high defense targets to begin with, so it is only worth considering once you have upgraded Klukai all the way to V6. Before that, it is simply more efficient to spend your pulls elsewhere and use Planeta. Speaking of, Planeta is a weapon everyone should be quite familiar with by now. It also grants a high base attack value of 376 and a crit damage bonus of 25%. Its weapon effect, Path Patrol, grants a stacking damage buff whenever a kill is made or an extra action ends. At base, this grants 4% damage up to 5 times, totaling to a 20% damage bonus. At max calibration, this can stack up to 40%. Stacking this effect is extremely easy for Klukai, aside from her ability to rake in kills in normal maps. Whenever she makes use of her ultimate a second time within a turn, it is considered an extra action, which generates a stack of Path Patrol. Afterwards, her ultimate gives her extra movement, which is also considered as one such extra action, granting another stack of Path Patrol. Planeta's weapon trait is the more common assault rifle trait, which grants a random attack buff at the start of the turn when at full HP. This is weaker than Skiller's trait against bosses, but with favorable RNG it could be decent in most other situations. Since Klukai only deserves the best, there's no real point in discussing other options. If you are a new player who has not scrounged together the tokens for Planeta, you can bridge the time with her SR option HK416. As with all SR weapons, its base attack is much lower than the SSR alternatives, but its effect grants a 10% damage bonus up to 20% at max calibration when hitting 2 or more targets, which should be easily accomplished in all map stages. The trait is the same as for Skiller, but as explained, the benefit of this will be diminished against lower defense targets. As for her attachments, there are, as with any DPS, 2 choices in front of you. As of now, the best set to maximize her damage is Corrosion Boost, which grants a 20% damage bonus to the entirety of her kit. However, farming elemental sets is inefficient in terms of stamina, and calibrating them is inefficient with respect to gold and, more importantly, the upcoming new chips. If you are unaware, the recently introduced fire control calibration chips will enable us to maximize the attributes of our attachment pieces. Since the chips will be limited, the best approach is to use generic attachment sets that can be shared across teams. Enter Phase Strike. While its damage bonus is 5% below an element-specific set, this effectively amounts to a 2 to 3% difference in damage, which is easily overcome by fully maxed attributes. Therefore, my long-term recommendation is to only farm and repeatedly calibrate Phase Strike pieces from now on. If you already have a Corrosion Boost set prepared for Klukai, you can of course use that, but do not go overboard with the calibrations. If all of this is news to you, I refer you to my recent video covering this topic. Before I let you go, let's quickly go over some team building and gameplay tips. When using Klukai for boss battles, your main concern has to be the number of confectance points you are able to regenerate each turn. With Klukai's V6, the easiest solution is to bring Petya. Klukai's ultimate generates 1 confectance point for herself, and each of Petya's 3 assists restore another point. The confectance points gained during her ultimate count towards its cooldown reduction, so with 4 confectance points gained, the cooldown is lowered by 2 turns. With the second use of the ultimate and the next 3 assists, she has gained a total of 8 confectance points, lowering her cooldown by 4 turns. Now she only needs 1 more support action or corrosion damage to gain the 9th confectance point and fully reset her ultimate for the next turn. If your Klukai is not V6, you'll require some additional help, since without the extra dot triggers, Petya will, at most, regenerate 4 confectance points for Klukai, meaning you're still missing 3 points. As a side note, the duo is also quite effective at stacking up Klukai's corrosive infusion dot. By the end of the team's first turn, we're already more than halfway to the stack limit of 15. On the second round, coinciding with the stability break of the boss, we're just in time to max out the dot. Naturally, Klukai works without Petya, but with the current global roster, the teams that can consistently put out 7 support actions per round are somewhat limited. As of now, the team most suited for the task is the Burn team, whose members can put out a total of 8 support actions initiated by 3 single target attacks each round, assuming you have access to a V3 Changju. In a setup like this, you want to get out Klukai's ultimate early, unless you're close to stability breaking the boss. This gets the dot stacking going and starts recharging her ultimate as soon as possible. After using her ultimate twice, she has gained 2 confectance points and needs another 7. Sharkri's S1 triggers an assist from Xenia, then 1 from Sharkri due to the overburn application by the skill, then 1 more from Changju, which again applies overburn to trigger Sharkri for a second time. This sequence has added another 4 confectance points for Klukai, reducing her cooldown in total by 4 turns. As Papasha attacks, the burn squad springs into action once more, and the City Warden's assist also counts as a support action in favor of Klukai. With that, the target of 9 confectance points has been achieved, and corrosive infusion is at 7 stacks, only slightly lagging behind the setup with Petya. Klukai maxes the stack limit on the next round upon the second use of her ultimate. If you're trying to build 2 teams around the V6 Klukai, these are your best choices for now. One team with Petya and another one using the burn team. When you want to make her work on other teams, you may be able to do it if you use her first fix key Deadly Entwine, which restores 2 extra confectance points per turn. That way, you only require 5 support actions out of your team members, which may be more achievable. It goes without saying that her bossing gameplay is extremely streamlined. Spam ultimate twice every round, profit. If you're using your own V0 Klukai for general content, you realize that she doesn't just face roll the entire map as she would with more dupes. The contrast becomes more precarious when you've used a V6 Klukai via the support system. Don't be too disheartened though, she may not run the show solo, but a team consists of more than one member. If you need multiple attempts to clear out a camp, that's fine too. Just keep in mind that your ultimate should ideally kill 2 targets, or you may be better off using her skills first. The only exception being when you really need the mobility. When your ultimate is on cooldown, which it will be at V0, be smart about your skills. Her S1, if it scores a kill, restores 2 extra confectance points and lowers the ultimate cooldown. So in a situation where you have 2 enemies isolated like this, you can get her cooldown lowered by 2 extra turns than if you had used her S2. Finally, depending on your crit rate, you don't have to take the damage preview at face value. Even if the preview makes you believe that you won't score the required 2 kills, you can still fish for crits so long as you have access to rewinds. Do note that rewinding does not give you a new chance for a crit, but is only meant to change your course of action if Lady Luck didn't favor you. And with that, we've come to the end of this guide. I hope everyone's enjoying their time with the Biker Queen. Let me know in the comments how many copies you obtained and how many pulls it took. As for myself, it took me all of my saved up roughly 700 pulls to get her to V6, dragging me to soft pity every time and getting chastised by dupes of Sabrina and Mosin, and Webley twice. Not the best of times, but that is the way of gacha. In any case, thank you so much for watching. See you next time.